here we are yet again, digging into the bodily assumption of Holy Mary from Gavin Ortlund, replying to Gavin Ortlund again, digging into what Gavin Ortlund has to say. I don't know how long this video will be, probably shorter than the other ones. The reason being, Gavin Ortlund, the very first video he put out, we thoroughly refuted it, thoroughly rebutted it. The majority of those points he has pretty much retired, is not using anymore. But some of those points he does continue to repeat over and over. Another thing that really is very concerning is where Dr. Ortlund is getting his material from. Is he doing actual research? Is he reading the material? It is our opinion that Dr. Ortlund is not doing the research needed, and he is, whether purposely or not doing it on purpose, but he's definitely misrepresenting the information. But I'm glad that he's doing these videos because he's definitely bringing attention to the bodily assumption of Holy Mary. More people are getting on board. Catholics are saying, I did not know how incredibly powerful the biblical and historical testimony to the bodily assumption of Holy Mary was. Now I do know. Dr. Ortlund, thank you. You're doing a great job in helping bring more people into the church, more people into apostolic Christianity. But let's dig in, because even though Dr. Ortlund, I think he only made a 35-minute video, even though it's only a 35-minute video, I'm going to light this wonderful candle before. Even though it is only a 35-minute video, in order to unpack it would probably need a lot more than 35 minutes. It really is just the nature of the way things go. We'll try and make it as thorough as can be. Probably have to repeat things that are done in the first video. And a little bit of shocking information we will be sharing as well. Number one, this sharing work very likely seems to be where Dr. Ortlund is getting his very bad information from, one of the places at least. And it's just very disheartening that the actual research and the homework is not being done by Dr. Ortlund. But I get it. A lot of the times his followers and subs ask for videos like this. Do you think Dr. Ortlund is going to learn the material in a month or less, material that can take years to learn and master? No, he's not going to. He's going to put out a video and the information is not going to be very sharp. That is what we believe is the issue here with his relentless repetition of material that has been refuted over and over. What else can be said when the material being put out has been thoroughly rebutted, but you continue to repeat it? The clear issue is Dr. Ortlund's not representing the information properly. We talked to numerous scholars, Dormition and Assumption scholars. They confirmed for us that Dr. Ortlund's information is out of touch with the top scholarship. He is incorrect. So let's dig in, though.
Doing some work lately on the bodily assumption of Mary. This is one of those really important areas where Protestant Christians differ from various other traditions. And one of the big points of difference is, where does this belief come from? And then when did it come into church history? So I've put out two videos recently. Well, not put out. One of them I put out on my channel, and then Cameron Bertuzzi at Capturing Christianity had me on his channel.
So let's dig in right away. Remember in one of the previous videos, or both, or multiple ones, Dr. Ortlund has made the claim, and I'm going to refer to him as Gavin. If he doesn't like that, he can let me know, and I'll refer to him as Doctor if he wants. Gavin has over and over has made the claim that within Protestantism and Catholicism, there's a moving away from one another when it comes to Mariology. We could not agree more with Dr. Ortlund. He's right. There's a massive moving away. The reason being very clear, as we have documented. Dr. Ortlund didn't like it. He says, well, William, why do you bring up the reformers? How is that relevant? It's relevant when you keep talking about how we're moving further away from one another in terms of the Marian dogmas. How else would it be relevant? I have to bring them up to show that the reason we're moving further away from one another is because Protestantism continues to mutate into something that is not even remotely, doesn't even remotely resemble apostolic Christianity. And Dr. Ortlund knows that. That's why Dr. Ortlund is doing his best to try to make it seem like his faith has a grasp or a foothold in the ancient apostolic church, and it doesn't. It doesn't. Essentially, modern day Protestantism are essentially their own private interpreters. They are their own arbiters of truth. They decide what the scripture says. They decide what it means. They are the sole interpreters of truth. How else can you really break it down and explain the fact that they're not even on board with the ancient reformers? I mean, how else can we talk about this if, number one, they're out of touch with the early church, they're out of touch with the medieval church, they're not even in touch with the reformers? So then where is their belief system? Where does it originate from? If you can't pinpoint it to the ancient reform, we're talking about Mariology, by the way. If you can't pinpoint it to the ancient reformers or the early church fathers, essentially it comes down to the fact that they have to believe that they are correct. They know more than the early church fathers, and they know more than the reformers as well. Dr. Ortlund, Gavin clearly is well learned. He knows more than John Calvin. He knows more than Francis Turretin. He probably could destroy Martin Luther in a debate. He knows more than Luther. The point being, I'm tossing this out in a bit of a tongue-in-cheek kind of manner, for very clear reason. Dr. Ortlund, Gavin would have to pretty much make that argument to try to make sense to his audience as to why in Protestantism there is this shedding off, if you will, of these Marian beliefs. Well, why did the reformers believe them? A lot of them. Why did the early church fathers believe them? Yet the modern day Protestants don't believe them. They shudder at the idea of venerating Mary. The very fact of the matter is that Protestantism is a sinking ship. I've said it before over and over, and I want to emphasize it for the audience. At the table, there's a big table. At that table is apostolic Christianity. And at that table, you have got the Orthodox and you've got the Catholics. Sit down at that table. Without a doubt, you've got them there at the table. Protestants are not at that table. They're not apostolic. They're not apostolic Christians. Their faith is not apostolic based. I've got to emphasize that over and over. There is a resurgence, if you will, today within modern day Protestantism to try to identify with the early church fathers, all the while really just making a mess of what they actually taught, a mess of what they actually believed. But when we actually examine the information, we realize that they're very wrong. And we're going to have to repeat over and over what we've already done. We've refuted all of this before. We've already dealt with it. Yet here we are again, repeating what we've already dealt with, for the sake of people that say, well, Dr. Ortlund came out with another video. There's nothing new there. He ignores what we presented on Epiphanius. He ignores what we presented on Daily. He ignores a lot of the information. What I am appreciative of is that he didn't bring up a gentleman that is not a Dormition or Assumption scholar that he did bring up in the first video. I have no idea why. Actually, I do have a little bit of an idea why. Very interesting, where he got a couple of quotes from. We're going to look at the webpage where he actually grabbed them from. A very unfortunate fact that Dr. Ortlund, the kind of information he's putting out, we're really disappointed with it. Now, the charge of me being uncharitable, me being mean, it comes up all the time as well. Look, I don't ever go to Dr. Ortlund's page. I don't go there. I don't have the time. I'm working on a lot of stuff, working on books, debates, travels, talks. I don't have the time. But every now and then people will send me screenshots saying, well, Dr. Ortlund, they've released another video. It says you're a meanie in the video, and in the comment section, all these people think you're meanies. You're a meanie. What am I doing that would label me a mean guy? By refuting Dr. Ortlund and pointing to the audience that I think he's being dishonest, misrepresenting the information? If people think that is mean, I don't care. I really don't care. If you are offended, you're likely going to be a Protestant and your faith is being shaken and you are furious because you think the material Gavin is putting out is quality material. And then along comes anybody and they shred it and they refute it, and you think they're mean because your faith has been shaken. They're not mean. That means you've got to reevaluate what you're believing in, who you are following. You've got to reevaluate it, especially if the information is refuted to this point, to the point of it just being shocking that anybody would be hold up any of Gavin's videos on Mariology and say, well, look at this video. This video really is the definitive on the matter. I can't recommend them. I don't think they have good information. And back to the point that people ask me, well, will you and Gavin ever debate? It'll never happen. It'll never happen. And that's perfectly fine. There are people out there that I'm debating on this topic. Head over to Pints of Aquinas. We've had an incredibly great, fun debate over there with the incredible Francis Turretin over there on Pints of Aquinas. More Mariology debates. I'll be debating one of the top scholars in Islam on Mariology. So people, don't cry, don't shed tears. Well, Gavin's never going to debate William. It won't ever happen. It's not going to happen. But that's perfectly fine. I have nothing against Gavin. I remain in contact with him, whether he ever wants to talk with me, do a show with me, or ever be in contact with me. I am there, willing to hear him, willing to dialogue with him, open to dialogue, always open to dialogue. But the kind of information Dr. Ortlund's putting out, if he's upset or his feelings get hurt because I'm refuting him, and I do so with strength to present clarity in the manner in which I do, I apologize to the audience. I don't care. I don't. I'm going to continue refuting the material, and I'm not going to change a thing, because when I realize somebody is ripping the material out of context the way Gavin is doing it, I'm going to refute the material, and I'm going to tell the audience I don't think that they're presenting a logical case. Simple as that. And I don't think this is good information right here.
I'll link to both of those if you want to see kind of my full answer to this question. But in this video, I just want to follow up on a couple of points where I think there is some confusion out there about the timeline, and then also about the nature of some of these early texts. So hopefully I can bring some clarity to some points where I think there is some confusion. So what we'll do is three things. First, actually four things. Four sections here. First, I'll give just a very brief general sketch of the timeline of,
and the timeline is out as well. It's incorrect.
The chronology for when this belief emerges. Secondly, I'll talk about the earliest text in which the bodily assumption of
He got that wrong too as well, by the way.
Mary is referenced, the Book of Mary's Repose. People put a lot of weight on this text, but very few people have read it. So I'm really excited to kind of bring it into the discussion a little bit so people understand what they're referencing. Thirdly, I want to talk about a 4th century text just after that, called the Six. Well, it's a set of texts, the 6 books, Dormition, Apocryphon. I'll explain what that is. And then, so hopefully by that point, you'll get a kind of, the idea of this video is to give you a rough sketch, kind of a drive-by sketch of how this belief is developing in the early church, really outside the early church, and then comes into the church in the 5th century. And I'll talk about that. And then the last thing is kind of summing up. I want to locate my interpretation and my comments in relation to William Albrecht's videos. He's put out 2 videos by way of critique. So
remember the comments being made of when this actually appears. He gives it a rather late date. But we've presented to you before that Shoemaker doesn't make that argument. Daly doesn't make that argument. They are not the only scholars on the bodily assumption of Mary. They're not the only ones. There are other scholars, and they don't put it that late. And we've played the clip of Daly before, where the Reverend Dr. Daly very clearly says differently than what Dr. Ortlund is saying. Some of these homilies teaching about her all immaculate nature in the very same vein as talking about her being Mother of God, the Dormition, the Assumption, and her being perpetual virgin. I mean, just they're loaded with Mariology, aren't they?
Right? Absolutely. And to me, one of the interesting things is that this is first expressed in devotion, in liturgy, in prayer. And we know that it was a focus of liturgy from the 2nd century. And then it's expressed in narration, in stories. And then finally, it's kind of analyzed and explained in homilies. And
so here is the important thing that we've got to really emphasize again. The Reverend Dr. Daly doesn't believe that this basically just came into existence in the 5th century. He believes it has a very early date. The belief in the bodily assumption of Holy Mary is incredibly early. You just heard Father Daly. Not only is it incredibly early, the idea of a fixed narrative is the topic that Daly is talking about when he says 5th century. What does that mean? That means that there is a fixed kind of story that begins being utilized in the church at that time. It doesn't mean that the first texts are from the 5th century. How can you make that claim, Dr. Ortlund, if over and over you realize Daly, Shoemaker, Cattouse, and many others say that Epiphanius talked about the bodily assumption of Mary? That is not 5th century. What about St. Ephrem? The fact that the top Syriac scholar in the world, Brock, will clearly tell you, not only Brock, but Harrach and multiple other top Syriac scholars will tell you Ephrem taught the bodily assumption of Mary. Is that heterodox? Is that 5th century? Why not utilize and deal with the information we actually have rather than continuing to present erroneous information that has been refuted already? People say, William is too over the top. William is mean. If my enthusiasm and love for the faith offends you, turn my videos off. I'm sorry that you're offended because you're Protestant and your faith is being shaken to the core. My advice for you is keep listening. But after hearing me, who cares about what William Albrecht has to say? Go read what the fathers say about the Dormition, the Assumption. Read what the great St. Germanus says, or the great St. John, or the great St. Ephrem. Which one of them is relying upon a heterodox document? Imagine the audacity. These documents are dated later, the heterodox ones, to the time of St. Ephrem, but St. Ephrem ripped them off, right? Even though he utilizes not a word of them. Not a word of them. But St. Ephrem very clearly ripped off from them, right? This has its origin in Gnosticism, we're told. Good luck finding a scholar making that argument. And I'm not talking about scholars that write books where they mention Mary. Those are a dime a dozen. I could find 100 or more that talk about Mary in a book of theirs. It doesn't mean they are a scholar on the Dormition. Look, let's stop playing games here. You know, this isn't hopscotch. Come on, it's time to get serious. When we're talking about actual Dormition and Assumption scholars, they don't make the claims that Gavin Ortlund is making. And we're going to talk about some of them later because I am good friends with a number of them. And one of them I spoke with, and we watched Gavin's video. And the information was, unfortunately, not good. I cannot recommend Gavin's video for that very reason. But let us continue digging in because Gavin does make a number of statements, and it is our goal to reply to everything, as long-winded as it may be, because you keep hearing the same thing over and over. You're going to hear probably about 100 times in this video, I'm joking, but I mean a lot of times, about, well, there's a fixed narrative. As if the fact that there's a fixed narrative, as if that means that that's when it comes into its origin. There are a number of scholars that would date this belief to the 1st century. And Gavin will say, well, this has not been received into scholarship. Really? Are you a scholar of the Assumption and Dormition? I'd like to ask these scholars that are considered cutting edge on the issue. I'd like to ask them, well, you know, is it true that this hasn't been received into scholarship? But they'll tell you, well, the fact that it's 1st century is debated by some, but they're not going beyond the 2nd century. They're moving the clock back. This is an incredibly early belief. An incredibly early belief. We have to emphasize that.
First, let's just give a general sketch here. In my initial video, I'd quoted some of the recent scholars like Stephen Shoemaker, Brian Daly, and then some of the older scholars working in this area like Ludwig Ott, Walter Burghardt, Juniper Carroll, etc., and basically showing they're consistent. And most of these scholars are Catholic And they're consistent in saying the same thing, that the emergence of historical evidence concerning the Assumption in the church is late 5th century, 450 to 500.
So if you want to talk about actual documents dating from that period, it's perfectly fine. But let's talk about what they say is the likely century where this belief originates from, or when they were written. Not when manuscripts are dated to, but when they believe they were written. Now, the information on Ott is skewed as well. Does Ott make that claim in regards to the Dormition narratives? He does. But Ott also believes this to be biblical. By the way you do this research is you dig into what the actual scholar says, what the actual figure says. And there's nobody better than Dr. Fastigi, who is an actual scholar and has translated Ott, is the driving force behind Fundamentals of Catholic Dogma and the driving force behind Denzinger. And I talked to Dr. Fastigi, and he told me, number one, the information on Ott is being misrepresented because Ott believed you could find the bodily assumption within Scripture, and he made arguments for it being scriptural. So how about we dial it back a bit and present the full picture on Ott? Does Ott make those statements about the 5th century in terms of when we have these texts that appear? He does. But Ott doesn't believe that the origin is the 5th century. The Reverend Dr. Ott believes that the origin is a biblical origin. How about we present the full picture? By the way, this has been confirmed to me by the definitive scholar on Ludwig Ott. It would be the gentleman that actually translated the work from the original to the language we have it in now, where we find it on Amazon or any good bookstore, Fundamentals of Catholic Dogma. And he's right, because when we read Ludwig Ott, we read things like, from her fullness of grace, spoken of in Luke 1:28, scholastic theology derives the doctrine of the bodily assumption and glorification of Mary. Since she was full of grace, she remained preserved from the threefold curse of sin, as well as from her return to dust. In the woman of the apocalypse, clothed with the sun, which in its literal sense must be taken to mean the church. Yet he still notes scholastic theology sees also the transfigured mother of Christ. And then he notes the fathers too refer to passages such as Psalm 131, in a typical sense, to the mystery of the bodily assumption. Arise, O Lord, into your resting place, you and the ark which you have sanctified, the ark of the covenant made from incorruptible wood, a type of the incorruptible body of Mary. And then he clearly connects that ark with Revelation 11 and 12. And the temple of God was open in heaven, and the ark of his covenant was seen in his temple. Ludwig Ott, do you believe this is 5th century? No, Ludwig Ott believed it was biblical. And we need to, in making arguments, show the full picture, not just little snippets here and there. Because once we do present the full picture, it is no longer convenient for the Protestant case. And problems arise. They arise. This is incredible. Remember, if you want to get a copy of this magnificent book, get a copy of the incredible work done by the magnificent Dr. Fastigi, who indeed is a top-notch scholar and has confirmed for us, indeed, this reading is the correct reading, and Ludwig Ott is being misrepresented. How did Pius XII arrive at the conclusion that the Assumption was revealed by God? By the evidence which emerges from the following sources, which he enumerates in the Apostolic Constitution. Number one, the unanimous consensus of the church teaching or the magisterium. 2, sacred scripture. 3, sacred tradition. 4, the sacred liturgy and the connection between the Assumption and other Catholic truths. So what does Juniper Carroll believe? He believes it is found in scripture and it is found in sacred tradition. he very clearly notes, let's go down here. Very clearly notes. Look at this. The Bible, of course, nowhere makes an explicit mention concerning Our Lady's Assumption, but this doctrine is undoubtedly implied in the Proto-Evangelium. It is on this biblical passage that Pius XII places particular emphasis, arguing substantially in this manner. He goes on to make the argument on a number of passages. So even Juniper Carroll, by the way, there's a lot that Juniper Carroll has to say about the bodily assumption. But it's really important to point out, I've got to emphasize over and over, even if these scholars are saying, well, there's a text that appears in the 5th century, or there are fixed narratives in the 5th century, they don't believe that that is the, even those that say that there are narratives that become fixed in the 5th century, they don't believe that they were first written in the 5th century. They believe they're much earlier, as we've shown multiple testimonies already. Even Juniper Carroll, even Ludwig Ott are very clear. They believe this to be biblical. Juniper Carroll strongly believed in the bodily assumption of Mary and believed it could be extrapolated from sacred scripture as well. So let's show the full picture. Let's say, well, these scholars are saying that there are texts that emerge in the 5th century, but they believe those texts have an origin to an earlier date, much earlier. And they believe that this teaching is an ancient apostolic one that can be found in the Bible. How about we say that? Because that would be true. Much closer to the reality than what we are hearing from Gavin Ortlund. I would like to remind the audience that we are attempting to deal with every comment that we believe is relevant from Dr. Ortlund. And you know, whenever I hear a show, I will make a mark, and you can probably barely see on my phone. There's a long list of things that I've got to go through, line by line, stuff that I think is worth responding to. A lot of this will probably be repeated because we've talked about a lot of this already. Dr. Ortlund is not engaged with a lot of what we talked about already. I think he says he's writing a book. Maybe he'll deal with it in the book. But what have you, either which way, well, let's continue digging in.
For example, let's go through some of these texts. And this is, by the way, why when I was talking with Cameron, I was very careful to talk about Dormition traditions in the church. The late 5th century date, you know, Brian Daly talks about the 5th century as this meteoric rise.
He talks about the 5th century as being the meteoric rise, where there's a fixed narrative. There's a very big difference. And I wish Gavin would deal with what Father Daly actually says on my show. I don't think he will. The other problem is Gavin is completely oblivious to the Syriac fathers. And by the way, let's go back to that. Here's the one thing that just really blows me away. Gavin really made much issue of me confusing him and Cameron. How about you make issue with the actual material that I refuted, rather than being upset that I confused you two? I wasn't able to pull up the video, so I made a mistake. I made a mistake, and I confused the words. I mixed them up. What Cameron said, I had written a note in my phone, and I was wrong. I didn't pull the video up. But there was no error in the material. In the actual material dealt with, there were no errors. And Gavin Ortlund threw his hands up. I'm not going to watch any more of the video because I confused him. I actually thought a comment said by Cameron was made by him. Eventually he did watch the video, which is good. I don't know if he ever watched the first video, which is much more thorough. But if he did, he clearly did not learn from it, because he continues repeating same arguments that are incorrect over and over. So there's an issue with that. He has not dealt with St. Ephrem. Ephrem is not heterodox. He's not sufficiently dealt with St. Epiphanius. In fact, he is really unable to deal with St. Epiphanius. That to me is problematic.
In interest in Mary, and it's after you get the Theotokos label at the Council of Ephesus in 431, there's this massive uptick of interest in Mary within the church. Okay, that's in the church. Before the 5th century, the texts that come into view later, but date back there before the 5th century, are not in the church.
So here's the problem. And it's a problem we've detected a number of times. You have got the top scholars on the Dormition and Mariology that believe that St. Epiphanius taught the bodily assumption of Mary. Was he a church father? Was he 5th century, or was he before? These very same scholars that Gavin continues to name drop believe that Epiphanius taught the bodily assumption of Mary. Shoemaker believes Epiphanius taught the bodily assumption. The Reverend Daly believes that Shoemaker he probably does believe Shoemaker that teaches the bodily assumption. Father Daly believes that Epiphanius taught in the bodily assumption of Mary. The top Mariologist of our times, the Reverend Dr. Koppas, believes that Epiphanius taught in the bodily assumption of Mary. So these statements are out of touch with reality, and he continues to avoid what Epiphanius is teaching. I have told Gavin over and over, I'm willing to debate you on Epiphanius or on anything in regards to Mariology. Get it done. Set it up. Let's get it done.
These are heterodox texts.
Ephraim is not heterodox. Epiphanius is not heterodox.
So let me show that. I think what people do is they're really eager to push that 5th century date back. And they're so eager that they'll latch onto little statements about these Gnostic legends as though that is changing the time frame, but they've never read the Gnostic legend and they don't realize what it is.
I have read them. I have read them very, very many times, and very, very in depth. And the problem is that this belief doesn't originate from Gnostic texts. We've shown where Shoemaker clearly says over and over that these are not Gnostic in origin. There are multiple scholars that will say that these are not Gnostic in origin. So why does Gavin Ortlund continue to try to make the argument that they are Gnostic in origin? If Shoemaker himself says they may have had Gnostic contact, but they are not Gnostic in origin. Dr. Cattouse, by the way, who is one of the top Dormition and Assumption scholars in the world, I personally spoke with her, and I got permission to utilize what she told me personally in personal dialogue. She said, William, I am not aware of any scholar working on the assumption of Mary in Dormition narratives that believe that these have their origin in Gnosticism. Let me repeat what one of the top scholars in the field says. And by the way, people want to come back and say, well, William, you don't believe everything that these scholars believe, do you? That's not the point. The point is to show that these people in academia are considered the top scholars on the assumption and the Dormition. They're considered the top scholars, and none of them believe this has Gnostic origins. So that's the important point. Now, I don't bow down to academia at all, but we're on the topic of academia, and she told me, this is incorrect information. Nobody makes the argument that these have their origins in Gnosticism. This was a very in-depth conversation I had with her over the course of multiple days, where I'm going to share multiple names of scholars that she's given me permission to share that will say this is 2nd century. Some even argue 1st century. These are top scholars. And she says, William, the idea that this has its origin in Gnosticism is not part of the scholarship on the assumption, on the Dormition. It is not part of that scholarship. I don't know what else needs to be done. What Gavin begins to do is read clearly heterodox tales. And here's the problem. Now, why are we not going to read them? Because we don't believe that that's where the teaching comes from. We can date it to before. Look, if we can find church fathers that taught the bodily assumption before these documents he's going to read, why would we waste our time believing that this is their origin? Can I emphasize again? If there are church fathers, let me say it slowly, slowly, slowly. If there are church fathers that taught the bodily assumption of Mary before any of these heretical documents were written, how can the bodily assumption dogma have its origin in a heterodox document? Maybe I need to speak very slowly for some people to get it. Perhaps. But here's another problem that Gavin has not dealt with. The other massive problem that Gavin has not dealt with is the fact that there are multiple fathers from the Dormition and Assumption era. And we call it Dormition and Assumption era because that's really when these documents explode. And none of them are relying upon these heterodox documents. Where on earth do you read any of these Assumption or Dormition fathers? Where do you read them and find them adopting the heterodox teachings or adopting what is heterodox or adopting these documents and saying, this is where we get this teaching from? You don't have it there. Now, I've heard the arguments, well, of course, they cleansed the documents. Really? Really? You think they were that stupid? You think they were so stupid that they would get the documents and excise the heretical stuff and say, okay, well, we're going to use it now. The origin is heterodoxy. It's a heretical document, but we're going to remove the heretical stuff and we'll use what is not heretical. No, I have quoted prominent saints within our church and our faith that are very clear that this is not where the origin of this teaching comes from. They're aware of the heretical documents that were condemned, by the way, and they're not utilizing those as the base of this belief. I wish that would be dealt with. I wish that would be dealt with, but it's not dealt with by Gavin Ortlund.
Between the earlier texts and the later texts, I know enough about history and historical study to know you have to be very careful. So I can say, I think that's a very plausible view. That's certainly what it looks like. You know, in my talking with Cameron, I basically said, it's really hard to be dogmatic about this, but that's certainly what it would kind of a superficial appearance of what the evidence seems to indicate. It's just hard to nail that down for sure. So I don't say for sure, but what we can say is the earliest text in history referencing a bodily assumption of Mary is a Gnostic text. How that text then influences the subsequent development, that, you know, you don't need to nail that down exactly to see that much. All right.
Rewind that a little bit. Right around here.
In his response video, William Albrecht and his guest were just sort of laughing off the idea of a possible origins in Gnosticism as a preposterous claim.
Yeah, let's rewind that again. This is really interesting. Really interesting.
Of Mary is a Gnostic text. How that text then influences the subsequent development, that, you know, you don't need to nail that down exactly to see that much. All right. And now let me say another thing. I am being consistent with the scholarship on the.
Yeah, he's being really consistent, right? He's being very consistently wrong, is what he's being.
This point. In his response video, William Albrecht and his guest were just sort of laughing off the idea of a possible origins in Gnosticism as a preposterous claim.
So I'm being consistent with the scholarship. William and his friend, you know, laughing it off and this having Gnostic origins. You know, what a bunch of silly guys, right? Bunch of silly guys. Dr. Shoemaker says very clearly, and it seems that positing some sort of contact with Gnostic Christianity, but not necessarily a Gnostic origin. Not a Gnostic origin. I was asked the other day, somebody, every now and then, very rarely do I get people that are followers of Gavin that come to my channel. Some of them claim to be Catholic. They're clearly not Catholic. They'll come to my channel and say, "You're such a mean guy." They've never posted on my channel ever before. They say, "I'm a devout Catholic. I don't believe in the bodily assumption, but I'm a devout Catholic." They've never ever posted on my channel before, and now they've come out of the woodwork and they're posting, and they want to tell me I'm a mean guy. and they want to say, well, we believe the information Gavin has presented is much better. You have not rebutted it. Really? Gavin Ortlund's just making light of the fact that me and Subdeacon Daniel were laughing at his claims of a Gnostic origin. There's a reason why we were laughing. And you see it right here. We weren't laughing at Gavin. We're laughing at this idea that has been long put away already, that the bodily assumption of Mary has its origin within Gnosticism. You just heard him say that this is very clearly in line with scholarship, and we just read Shoemaker, who said it's not. I just quoted a scholar as well in Dr. Catus, who says, no, William, scholars that are working on this don't say it has Gnostic origins. We showed Daly, where Daly believes it's Orthodox. Ludwig Ott believes it's Orthodox. Juniper Cara believes it's Orthodox. So at the end of the day, I don't know what to say anymore. If this is the best that can be given to refute and rebut the bodily assumption of Mary, our churches need to grow. People need to abandon Protestantism. You're missing out on such beautiful teachings of Holy Mary, of Saint Mary. And when the best that can be given to you is misinformation or poorly presented information, I think it's time to reevaluate your faith. And I don't think Gavin's a bad guy, which I know Gavin will probably write a comment or make a video telling people that I was mean again. People will probably come and say I was mean. I don't understand that. Look, I've been debating for about 2 decades now. Never have I ever, I want to be very clear, never have I ever had people tell me that I am mean until I began refuting Gavin Ortlund. Then all of a sudden people said I was mean. I don't understand. I don't know. Maybe I guess it's a very sensitive audience. But understand that I'm not trying to be mean. But I truly believe that Protestantism is in error on this issue. And I call them to come to apostolic Christianity. If that is mean to you, well, then I think that my message is being misunderstood. It's not trying to be a mean-spirited message. It's trying to be a message that tells you to come home to Holy Mother Church, where the fullness of the faith, the fullness of the truth is found. And I think I want to reiterate that. I'm not being mean to Gavin. I would not be mean to Gavin if we debated. Would I like to debate Gavin? I wouldn't mind. I would debate anybody. So very clearly would debate anybody. I think that we are at a point where there is evidence being ignored. And once you get to that point of evidence being ignored, it's tough to really go beyond that. We've presented multiple fathers that believe in the bodily assumption of Mary. The Panarians one, Panarian 79, St. Epiphanius, however you want to pronounce it, St. Ephraim, where there are scholars that confirm it. The very scholars he's talking about here confirm it. How could he be telling me that Shoemaker would be making the argument that this is 5th century if Shoemaker himself tells us that Epiphanius taught the bodily assumption of Mary? It's arguments like this that really make me reconsider why I'm even doing this video. Why am I doing it? I am doing it for the edification of the people. I don't think this is particularly worthy of a response. And who knows, maybe it'll be the last one that I do on this topic to Gavin if he puts out another one. Unless there's something substantial he puts out. I'm not finding it. I think it may be better to just have a debate on the issue. But I'm not finding the substantial arguments being made. The information's being avoided, or the information's being presented incorrectly. And again, I don't want people to come back and say, William, you accused Gavin of being a liar. No, I'm not accusing Gavin of being a liar. I'm saying that I don't think Gavin has read the material much. I don't think he's well acquainted with the church fathers and the bodily assumption. And I don't think he's well acquainted with what scholarship says. Look, when your audience wants you to put a video out that requires a lot of reading, I'm talking about a lot of reading, you think you're going to put a definitive workout in a week or two, or even a month or two? It requires a lot of studying and a lot of research, a lot of reading of primary material, first-hand source material, and scholarly material that talks about that first-hand source material. And it's my hope that the more and more Gavin does read and study this, he'll eventually come back and say, well, okay, maybe it's possible. I'd love to see Gavin become Catholic. But right now, Gavin is so invested in trying to tell his audience it's going to be okay. We have a foothold in the early church. It's going to be okay. But eventually, you're going to realize that this foothold is non-existent. Protestantism doesn't have a foothold in apostolic Christianity. That's really a scary thought. The fact that what modern-day Protestants believe doesn't resemble the early church. It's a scary thought. And it's one where Protestants really need to really reconsider. And they need to really study the apostolic faith more. We emphasize and urge that.
Now, he's right about Daly. Daly thinks, as we saw from the quote and elsewhere, and he's stuck to this view throughout his career, that it's the anti-Chalcedonians in the 5th century where this idea emerges.
No, Gavin. I've shown it multiple times. He doesn't believe that. He even says that he believes that the origin is much earlier than the Chalcedonian period. But you're also misunderstanding what he says when he talks about bishops or fathers that are not Chalcedonians. Gavin, you really need to study up and learn on the differences between the Catholics and the Syriac Orthodox to understand when the term, when it's very clearly noted that these fathers were not Chalcedonian. It doesn't mean that they were against the teachings of Chalcedon or against what Pope St. Leo the Great taught. It doesn't mean that at all. In fact, as we've said it over and over, the great teachings of St. Cyril and Pope St. Leo the Great are very much in line. And that statement is usually made when referring to Christology, Dr. Ortlund. So let's be very clear here. That's not what Daly means. He doesn't mean that it comes from a heterodox or a community that would have had a teaching that would have rivaled or gone against what was taught at Chalcedon. The assumption does not have its origins in Gnosticism.
Now, he's right about Daly. Daly thinks, as we saw from the quote and elsewhere, and he's stuck to this view throughout his career, that it's the anti-Chalcedonians in the 5th century where this idea emerges. But he's wrong about Shoemaker.
I don't think that Gavin even has any idea who Daly is referring to when he says anti-Chalcedonians, because despite the controversy over Chalcedon, there's no living Christological scholar, which, by the way, Daly is one of the top Christology scholars in the world, which is why he uses that term to clearly show who he's referring to, what group of Christians. And there's none that would argue that the Christology of Pope St. Leo the Great would differ from that of St. Cyril of Alexandria, which is the heart of the crux of the issue of those that opposed Chalcedon. That is no longer a barrier between us. Now, is Gavin even aware of that? I don't think Gavin has any clue as to the controversies there. I don't think Gavin's well read on the councils. There's nothing wrong with that. But again, Gavin's presenting information as if he knows what he's talking about, knows what Daly's talking about, and he's wrong. Number one, when Daly's talking about groups that are not Chalcedonian, it's very clearly talking about the Syriac Christians. But they were not erroneous in their Christology. They were perfectly orthodox. Number two, no, I'm not wrong about Shoemaker. Let's rewind that again and let's hear what he has to say here. This is very interesting. Its origins in Gnosticism. So I say that scholarship shows that this doesn't have origins in Gnosticism. And his response is to talk about anti-Chalcedonian groups. Were those Gnostic groups, Gavin? I'm actually shocked at the point he's even attempting to make. But let's listen again.
Now, he's right about Daly. Daly thinks, as we saw from the quote and elsewhere, and he's stuck to this view throughout his career, that it's the anti-Chalcedonians in the 5th century where this idea emerges. But he's wrong about Shoemaker.
Its origins in Gnosticism. I'm wrong about Shoemaker? About this having origins in Gnosticism? You heard what my claim was. He says, I'm wrong about Shoemaker. I'm baffled. Not only then is there no evidence to support an anti-Chalcedonian origin, but the contents of the narratives themselves seem to contradict such a hypothesis. But I'm wrong about Shoemaker. I've shown where Shoemaker says it's no Gnostic origin, and I've just shown where he says there's no evidence to support an anti-Chalcedonian origin. But I'm wrong about the scholarship. Audience, I can't emphasize enough for you how important the show that I did with Subdeacon Daniel was. And I think Gavin just didn't get it. It was to show unity between those that claim that there's an anti-Chalcedonian origin. You've got a Chalcedonian Catholic in me, a Chalcedonian Christian, and you have a Syriac one in Subdeacon Daniel. And we are showing harmony in this belief and showing that there is no anti-Chalcedonian origin, and this dates to before these claims. But Gavin didn't get that point. But I'm the one that's wrong? I don't think Gavin knows what these scholars mean by anti-Chalcedonian. He has no idea. Is he equating anti-Chalcedonian with the Gnostic? He doesn't realize. He's not aware of the debates. Now, this is shocking. For someone who's attempting to put out a scholarly video refuting the bodily assumption of Mary, this is not only sloppy, this is out of touch with scholarship. And I cannot grasp why over and over these videos are being applauded as being full of information that can help Protestants. I think it can help a Protestant that hasn't read up on these issues. But once you read up on them, you're going to abandon the sinking ship of Protestantism, and you're going to become Catholic. Keep reading up, because you're going to realize scholarship doesn't support the position that Gavin is putting forth.
Lost in the shuffle. Similarly, with other points that William and his guest were making about Jacob of Sirug, Ephraim, their supposed affirmations of a bodily assumption, what people will do is they'll quote Shoemaker and the other scholars on when they're in agreement with them, but on so many of these points, he's opposing those ideas.
All right, let's look at Saint Jacob of Sirug, and then we're going to look at Saint Ephraim. This is going to be important. We've done it before, we're going to do it again. King Jacob notes, death came that she might taste his cup. The Lord commanded the exalted hosts above and the flaming legions, the seraphim of light. This is incredible. On this day, Adam rejoices, and Eve his wife, because their daughter rests in the place where they are gathered. On this day, the righteous, Noah and Abraham, rejoice that their daughter has visited them in their dwelling place. On this day, let also Judah rejoice greatly, for behold, the daughter who was given life went forth from his loins. On this day, let Joseph rejoice, and the great Moses, for one young maiden has called all mankind to his light. Come, Ezekiel, trained in prophetic revelation. If the thing that has occurred is described in your prophecy, on this day, let also Isaiah the prophet rejoice. We have had scholars that look and study Syriac confirm to us that this is a bodily assumption. We have had them. Now, does it talk about the translation of the soul? Without a doubt, but it never says the body is not also translated. Indeed, all indication points to this being a bodily assumption. Saint Jacob, very clearly, she wove a beautiful crown, set it on her sublime head, on which valuable pearls were laid. This is a physical bodily assumption. If you don't agree with it, Gavin Ortlund, find a Syriac scholar, refute it, or debate the issues, and let's talk about them. Now, the other thing that I'd like to find out is, where on earth does Shoemaker even go into St. Ephraim? As far as I'm aware, he doesn't. But even at that, Gavin is being so inconsistent, because all the while when he wants to, he'll cherry pick Shoemaker. A Catholic has no problem saying they don't agree with everything Shoemaker says. No problem at all. In fact, I merely quote Shoemaker when he says 2nd century. I believe it is earlier. I am utilizing the top scholarship in the field. It doesn't mean that I agree with everything Shoemaker says. I believe it is earlier than 2nd century. And I believe in the bodily assumption being biblical. Here's another problem. Where on earth does he contest that Ephraim talked about the bodily assumption? That's very early. But we've heard nothing from Gavin about the bodily assumption of St. Mary. Why have we heard nothing about that? Why over and over he'll bring up Ephraim, he'll bring up Jacob, but he doesn't examine the text. He merely expects you to take his word at face value. But we've got to look at the text. When we do look at the text, it's very clear there is a bodily assumption in St. Jacob. There's also a bodily assumption in St. Ephraim. Let's check this out as well. Ephraim, remember the poetic and incredible kind of language utilized by these fathers, Syriac fathers. A lot of the times they, in a poetic manner, they'll put words onto the mouth of St. Mary and say, this is how they imagined this would have occurred. And Ephraim talks about the end of the Holy Mary's life. And at the end of her life, he says, I am about to enter into his living paradise. And in the place in which Eve succumbed, I shall glorify him. For all created women, he was most pleased with me, and he willed that I should be mother to him, and it pleased him that he should be a child to me. Bethlehem thanks you that she was found worthy to give birth to you. To a great height, he lifted me with my saints so that I might glorify him. Where? Where? In the vast and broad heaven, in the broad and vast heaven, full of its glory, but unable to contain within itself the greatness of the one who bent down and became small in the manger. This is very clearly the bodily assumption of Holy Mary. This has not been dealt with by Gavin Ortlund. In fact, we continue hearing earliest evidence is 5th century. Why don't you deal with that from the Syrian? I really have got to wonder. I know the answer why.
But during the 4th century. But Epiphanius himself clearly thinks the Collyridians are heretical, and his specific complaint against them is Mariolatry.
Yeah, they were offering sacrifice to Mary. There is no apostolic Christian that does that. They indeed were committing idolatry.
Worshipping Mary. Now, this is what I want to observe about Epiphanius that is so interesting, is he does not suggest at any point in his opposition to the Collyridians' practice of making sacrifices to Mary and so forth, that there's some kind of distinct practice of venerating Mary that is different from what they are doing.
Yeah, he does. Yet again, more very simple elementary blunders by Dr. Ortlund. He very much does. And maybe Dr. Ortlund is not reading all of Panarian 79. He clearly is avoiding that for a very clear reason. Why is that? Because Panarian 79, Epiphanius teaches the bodily assumption of Mary, and all the top scholars recognize that. Gavin, of course, does not accept that, and he, for some reason, is just completely avoiding Panarian 79. But the idea that Saint Epiphanius doesn't draw a distinction between proper veneration and praise and talk about how we honor Holy Mary and how worship shouldn't be given to Holy Mary is completely incorrect. He's very wrong. We've done a number of shows on St. Epiphanius, but it's worth revisiting this because it continues coming up, and I'm glad those shows have been done. But it continues coming up, and it just really is an unfortunate, a very odd thing as well. Because Epiphanius is very clear when he says in Panarian 79, yes, of course, Mary's body was holy, but she was not God. Yes, the Virgin was indeed a virgin and honored as such, but she was not given us to worship. She worships him who, though born of her flesh, has come from heaven, from the bosom of his Father. And the gospel, therefore, protects us by telling us so on the occasion when the Lord himself said, "Woman, what is between me and you? Mine hour is not yet come." To make sure that no one would suppose, because of the words, "What is between me and you," that the Holy Virgin is anything more than a woman. He called her woman, as if by prophecy, because of the schisms in sex that were to appear on earth. We know that. We agree with Epiphanius. We agree Mary is a woman. She was a creature. You don't offer worship to Mary. The Coloridians were incorrect in this regard. But does he then talk about proper praise and honor to Mary? He does. He's very clear. He says, like the bodies of the saints, however, she has been held in honor. You can give her honor for her character and understanding. And if I should say anything more, in her praise. So all the while condemning the Coloridians, number one, condemn them. They are offering sacrifice to Holy Mary, which, by the way, that tells you a whole lot. The early Christian community believed that the Holy Eucharist was a sacrifice. They were offering sacrifice to Mary. This is idolatry. But is there proper veneration of Mary? Of course. Epiphanius says she's held in honor, like the great saints. And if I should say anything more in her praise, he's praising her. She's like Elijah. How is she like Elijah? Perpetual virgin, and was taken up, has not seen death. He begins to heap praise and praise upon Mary. Just great things about Saint Mary. Just incredible. And look at this. She's like Saint Thecla. And Mary is still more honored than she, because of the providence vouchsafed her. Are you willing to tell me, when you read Epiphanius, that he's not talking about the fact that Mary is worthy of more honor than the other saints? He says it right here. She is still more honored. At this period of time, Saint Thecla was a model of virtue and virginity. Read the writings of the fathers, you'll get that. Scholars recognize that. Shoemaker recognizes that. And we're literally told by Saint Epiphanius, she is more honored. So you can give her honor. She's perpetual virgin. She's mother of God, Theotokos. She's holy. She's bodily assumed into heaven. But Elijah is not worshipped. And John is not worshipped. And Thecla is not worshipped either. But Mary is worthy of more honor than these saints. We can venerate her. We can ask for her intercession. Now, if you don't believe that Epiphanius believes in intercession of the dead, well, we can do a whole show just on that. But there's a clear problem here. The very clear problem here is the idea that, well, you know, veneration of Mary, what Catholics are doing, doesn't look like that. There's no real veneration. It's just worship. Just straight old worship. What the Coloridians are doing is worship, and there is no line where Epiphanius says no, but there is a proper way of honoring her. Really, he lays it out right here. He says, we honor Mary. We honor her more than these great saints. Yeah, the evidence is right there, right before you, which is all the more shocking to us that these arguments continue being made. Epiphanius, as we've pointed out before, whenever Gavin wants to hearken to Shoemaker, he'll do it when he thinks it's convenient to him. We have found that Shoemaker has been no friend to his position at all. Shoemaker doesn't agree with him either in Epiphanius, does he? We've covered that. Gavin has completely ignored it. Good. I'm glad he's completely ignored it. But it's unfortunate. It is unfortunate that the same arguments keep getting brought up. We've refuted this already well over a month ago or a month and a half ago. But either which way, these videos will do great service in bringing people closer to Holy Mary, closer to the fullness of the truth, closer to the fullness of the faith.
As an assumption is being opposed by people within the church. Okay, that's what distinguishes this from the 5th century date that the scholarship is advancing. I hope that makes sense. And then, as I pointed out in my initial video, Epiphanius is very clearly saying nobody knows her end.
So again, let's rewind a little bit. Number one, first off, I would like to note that Gavin never deals with the earliest Greek Dormition text of Mary, never deals with it. We know exactly why. Never deals with the fact that every single early church father, every single one is clear that this is not taken from heterodox texts. You even have fathers that are aware, they're very well aware of heretical texts floating out there, and they do not adopt any heretical text as the basis of their Dormition assumption Mariology. Number two, the other point, I'm going to have to really hammer it home over and over and over. I just have to emphasize, Dr. Ortlund'S wrong about Epiphanius. The top scholars recognize that he's wrong about Epiphanius. I know I've said it more than once, but I'm going to continue really emphasizing it.
And in my book, I'm writing a book on all this right now. I talk a lot more about some of the other passages in Epiphanius, some of the other issues. So, but that's basically how we could sum it up. So
I'd be interested in seeing what he has to say in the book. I already know his arguments. He's shared them. They are the arguments essentially the exact ones that you find Protestantism utilizing today, the common ones trying to deny that there's a bodily assumption there. But again, the top scholars on the bodily assumption and Dormition of Mary believe that Epiphanius clearly taught the bodily assumption in his writings. In fact, let's check him out again. In his first account from the letter to Arabia, as Epiphanius excoriates the Collyridian rituals, he turns suddenly to the question of the end of Mary's life, professing the strict agnosticism on this subject for which he has become so famous in various modern studies on the Dormition and the Assumption. Without making any transition to a new topic, he writes, "The Holy Virgin may have died and been buried. Her falling asleep was with honor, her death in purity, her crown in virginity, or she may have been put to death. As the scripture says, and a sword shall pierce through her soul. Her fame is among the martyrs, and her body, by which light rose in the world, rests amid blessings. Or she remained alive. For God is not incapable of doing whatever he wills. No one knows her end." Epiphanius then continues his attack on the Collyridians further, offering no explanation for his introduction of this topic and leaving the unmistakable impression that his discussion of the Dormition has something to do with the Collyridians. The overall effect is to link his opponent's bread offerings, sacrificial offerings, in Mary's honor with a question of how her life ended, a pairing that certainly suggests a connection with the 6 books Apocryphon. A similar association between the Collyridians' veneration of Mary and the Virgin's Dormition occurs in the penultimate section of the Panarion, which is dedicated exclusively to the refutation of this Marian heresy. After denouncing the Collyridian practice of allowing female clergy, Epiphanius eventually comes to address the bread offerings of the Virgin, which he attacks by comparing Mary with Elijah, John, and Thecla. In this way, he continues his apparent strategy of undermining this veneration of the Virgin, which was worship, it was latrevo, latruo, through a broader attack against veneration of the saints. The main point here is that just as Elijah, John, and Thecla are not venerated using blasphemous ritual practices. You catch that? There's a distinction between veneration and blasphemy. So there is no basis for the Collyridian veneration of Mary. Thecla's appearance in this context is to be expected. She had long served as the primary role model for female virginity, a role that Mary began to assume at this time. Yet comparisons with a prophet and an apostle were perhaps a little bit unexpected, given the harangue against women's liturgical leadership that preceded this discussion. What else does Shoemaker say? Instead, Epiphanius' comparisons with Elijah and John focus squarely on the miraculous manner in which each ended his life. Mary is like Elijah, he explains, in that he was a virgin from his mother's womb. He remained so perpetually and was assumed, and it's not seen death. Although this passage has been frequently overlooked in various studies of the Virgin's Dormition and Assumption, the last 2 points deserve particular emphasis. In contrast with a guarded agnosticism, of the letter to Arabia, which previous scholarship has overwhelmingly taken as evidence that Epiphanius knew no tradition of the end of Mary's life. Here he rather unambiguously proclaims that Mary, like Elijah, was assumed and has not seen death. Shoemaker believes Epiphanius taught the bodily assumption of Mary. The top Mariologist in the world, the Reverend Dr. Coppice, believes that Epiphanius taught about the bodily assumption of Mary. The Reverend Dr. Daly believes that Epiphanius taught the bodily assumption of Mary. Dr. Cattouse believes that Epiphanius taught the bodily assumption of Mary. These are the top either Mariologists or the top scholars on the Dormition and the assumption of Mary. People say, William, why is William so animated? He gets animated. The guy's full of energy. The guy's such a triumphalist. He's a tribalist. I got an email today of a Protestant just virtually cursing me out. Can you believe that? And I don't think all Protestants are like that. I love my Protestant friends. I love them, and a lot of them. I have a lot of Protestant mods. A lot of them are really reasonable. They're not hateful, but some people, they hate the fact that I'm filled with energy in my videos, filled with energy in my debates, because I have a fiery love for Holy Mary. I have a fiery love for the one true faith that can be found only in Catholicism. I'm on fire for the faith, so don't excuse me for being on fire for it, and please don't be offended by it. And if you're offended by it, well, I'm sorry. It's really not a whole lot I can tell you other than the fact that the amount of misinformation here is shocking. Look at what Shoemaker has to say. So I, with all due respect, I find, and I have heard Ortlund's interpretation of what Epiphanius means here, and I find it to be illogical. He is out of touch with the scholarship on Epiphanius. Even the great Reverend Dr. Daly says, we think of Epiphanius or Epiphanius, depending how people like to pronounce it. When we look at his Panarion and we notice him talking about the Assumption of Mary, before that, we rarely heard much about Mary's end, the end of her life. What could have happened to her? Why do you think that is the case? Do you think that they were more concerned with other issues, the Trinity, Christology? What are your opinions on that?
Well, that's a very interesting question. It's hard to know, but Epiphanius is a great reporter. He wants to chronicle every variation on Christian faith that was known to him. And so his work, one of his works, is kind of a catalog of heresies, talking about all the different ways people get the Christian faith kind of mixed up or distorted. And he also is very attentive to local liturgies, local celebrations, local sites. He came from Cyprus. Salamis, where his bishop is, on the island of Cyprus. And so he knew what was going on in, we think it was Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, Israel today, probably much better than people further west would have done. So he probably had been to Jerusalem himself and had seen these celebrations at Mary's tomb. And he tells us a lot of information about the early liturgies and the early understandings of the death of Mary. But this at an early time. Epiphanius is writing about 380, 390. And so it was all kind of in flux at that time. There was devotion, but we don't know exactly what it was like or how they did it. There aren't any documents besides him from that period. And so, we simply have to rely on what he tells us and how people were obviously interested in Mary and focusing their devotion on her, and also saying if she died in the grace of Christ, our son, she must be with him in heaven in some sense.
Incredible. She must be with him in heaven. The Reverend Dr. Daly, by the way, multiple times confirms for us that the great Saint Epiphanius believed in the bodily assumption of Mary. We've pointed this out a number of times. We've shown this clip a number of times already. We've got the very top scholars in this field confirming for us what Epiphanius does believe. That really should be enough when it comes to Epiphanius, but apparently people still cannot accept that. And I know why people can accept it, because it's tough for them to accept the fact that the bodily assumption of Saint Mary is ancient.
Epiphanius, some of the other issues. So, but that's basically how we could sum it up. So 3rd and 4th century, you've got heterodox legends and texts that are opposed by people in the church that are outside of the realm of Orthodox theology. And then in the 5th century, again, once you get the Theotokos label at Ephesus, which is originally a Christological label, but it starts spiraling up all of this interest in Mary, what Daly calls meteoric rise. Okay.
So a number of things here. Number one, as I mentioned with Subdeacon Daniel, by the way, who is an expert when it comes to councils, we noticed how you continue hearing the argument of, well, Theotokos is a Christological title. Nobody denies that. But it's also saying incredible things about Holy Mary. She is the God-bearer. She is the mother of God. It is a Christological title, but it's also a Mariological title. This is confirmed to us by the great Reverend Dr. Price. It is also a Mariological title. This is also confirmed by one of the top Christologists in the world, the Reverend Dr. Vainandi. This is a Christological title, of course. Nobody denies that. But it's also saying something incredibly special about Holy Mary. Now, the idea, again, we keep hearing that, well, this is where the scholarship is. This is where the scholarship is. Dr. Ortlund, we have to point out, is incorrect. He's incorrect, and I'd like to point people to the work of scholar Dr. Cattouse, who very clearly, I reached out, and I mentioned this earlier, and I am going to reveal a message that I sent Dr. Cattouse. This is exactly what I said. I have just looked over the 5th century Syriac palimpsest, fragments of the 6 books, and much more information and more texts that are available to be found online. I have also looked at the Vienna fragment you said is likely 1st or 2nd century. I've done a video on that. We've done a video on this as well. And I've looked at the evidence, noting how the early evidence dating notes that this does not have its origins within heterodoxy. In fact, following the evidence I've looked at, including scholars Dr. Cattouse and Dr. Shoemaker, cite Bodily, Mosconi, and Cothanet, and multiple others, note that this information is either early 2nd or 3rd century. But there are some top scholars like Dr. Cattouse who argue for it to be early 2nd, very possibly even 1st century, and does not have its origin in heterodoxy. I asked this top Dormition scholar, is my assessment correct? I asked her if I could share this information with the audience. Her response to me was, yes. You are correct, William. Now, the idea that the bodily assumption has its origins within Gnosticism is not shared or believed by any of these scholars. It is not. And I would recommend people look at these texts. If you can't read them, a lot of them are written. There are some great scholarly works in French. I cannot read French, but there's some great ones in German that I have read, excellent ones in Spanish that I have read, and great ones in English. They're not making the arguments that Dr. Ortlund is making. They're not. And I find it most unfortunate. And then, of course, any time I do a video about Gavin, it doesn't matter what video I do about Gavin. Gavin's always going to claim that I'm mean or that I insult him. I could literally do a video and barely mention his name, and he's going to say the same thing.
So basically, William's videos go into there's a lot of high over-the-top rhetoric and insults.
Yeah, it's always the same thing. Gavin's always a victim. Gavin is always insulted. He's always a victim. It's always time to rally the troops because William's a bad guy. He's a meanie. Look, we're not going to engage William because William's a bad guy. He's a meanie. It's always the same thing. And you know what? I've heard it. I've been hearing it from the beginning, from the very first time I engaged Dr. Ortlund. And I have noted that I have never found Gavin's material to be impressive or to be anything new under the sun. And he got offended at that. And that's not an insult. But I've responded to him because supporters of my material want the responses. And they say, look, he has a decent following. Can you do videos replying? And I love the people that follow my channel and love the Catholic faith, our ancient apostolic faith. So yes, I do reply to the videos. But I think people are starting to begin to see that there's not much here. There's more that Gavin has to say. Let's check it out. Essentially, the core of what of any refutation is pretty much done with. But there's more. There's more that we're going to check out. More statements and a shocking discovery that I made. Just unfortunate. I just when I found out that this is very likely what Gavin had done, I just, aside from face palming, I was just so disappointed. We'll talk about that in a moment, though. This has become long-winded for you. I'm sorry. Put it on 2-speed or cut it off and watch a replay. But God willing, this will edify people that are tuning in. I hope so. Now, here is a particular area where Gavin really tries to double down on and doesn't recognize just the unfortunate error that he does make here. And I made a statement with Subdeacon. By the way, Subdeacon Daniel saw the video done by Gavin as well. And Gavin here is saying that William misrepresents my knowledge on the apostolic churches, on the Eastern churches and what have you. Subdeacon Daniel agreed with me. He agreed with me. But let's check out what Gavin has to say. Chief Subdeacon, very clearly, the belief of this does not hinge or rely upon any definition that any pope made in 1950, does it?
Not at all.
Not at all.
So then he uses that observation to sort of insult my knowledge of the Eastern traditions, and he's done that elsewhere as well. And he's claimed, he says that I'm disrespecting them.
It's a bit disrespectful to not understand how firmly built into the faith of the apostolic churches that this really is.
So I'm watching this video and I'm like, just trying to remember, like I have no memory of saying that. So I'm just.
Well, let me refresh your memory, Gavin.
Hey, I need to make a decision about this. Do I believe that this is true or not? And a lot of that will depend upon one's view of authority, what you believe about the papacy.
Really? You have no memory of that because you've mentioned it multiple times. And yes, that is disrespectful to our Eastern brothers and sisters. And indeed, yes, Subdeacon Daniel watched the video and he said he was shocked at the fact that you say that depending on how one views the papacy, they will come to one conclusion or another. So yes, Dr. Ortlund, you did make this particular statement.
Camera and mic quality than me, and that was the first thing that William said in his critique. That was the first thing that we got into in the interview after Cameron's personal update. That's like the first thing.
Now, if Gavin's best rebuttal to me is that I confused a statement, said that I thought that it was from Gavin and it was from Cameron, and really he has no critique or any rebuttal of any of the information. That really does say a lot about his case here, but let's go deeper in.
We got into. So William and his friend were kind of going on and on about how, how do people not realize this? You're disrespecting these other traditions. How do people?
Yeah, we believe. Even I've talked to Orthodox, Syriac, and Oriental, Syriac, Eastern, where they've told me it is downright disrespectful. Gavin, your statements on whether or not one holds to the papacy being a turning point, being pretty much would hinging on the belief in the papacy as to whether or not you are going to believe in this, without a doubt, is disrespectful. We're not insulting you, Gavin. We're pointing out the obvious. And Gavin, I've said it multiple times. Yes, you are out of touch with the apostolic faith. Yes, in previous videos, you had no idea who Mark of Ephesus was. You misrepresented Mark of Ephesus. Nobody refers to Mark of Ephesus the way you did. Now, have you read up on him since then? Perhaps. And again, in your language on the anti-Chalcedonians and pitting them against the Chalcedonians, you're out of touch with the Syriac faith as well. This is something that requires years and years of reading and research, Gavin. You don't just sit down and learn about these apostolic faiths overnight. So yes, we believe, and not only me, very well-respected people in the community, apologists, not only Catholic, believe you are out of touch with the apostolic faiths. I have to emphasize that. And that is not an insult.
Not realize that the assumption of Mary is not just Catholic, it's also Eastern Orthodox, Oriental Orthodox, etc. But within 30 seconds of what they miscited me as saying, what it was Cameron saying, here's what I actually said. I was making the same point as them. And I'm going to be mentioning the Catholic doctrine a lot. I do want to be clear up front that the Catholic view is extremely similar to the view of Mary's final end in a lot of the Eastern traditions, like Eastern Orthodoxy, for example. And that's something I've talked about over and over in my videos. So it's really hard to understand how that level of misrepresentation can happen.
Yeah, you know very well, Gavin. You know very well that when I refer to the comment that Cameron actually made, I was not referring to the very same thing when I was talking about the disrespect by not recognizing that the Eastern faiths, our Syriac brothers and sisters as well, do not hold this based upon anything papal. That was what I was referring to, Gavin, and you know that very well because I say that. We mentioned that in the video more than once.
In his response videos, he does not represent others' views accurately. He's not careful to give an accurate representation of the position he is criticizing. I remember in the Purgatory videos he would put out, I think I counted 5 or 6 times where he would make a claim about my sources, and every single time he was wrong.
I was never wrong on the claims that I made because I backed him up by showing the proof of where they came from. Here's the problem with what Gavin Ortlund is saying. Gavin Ortlund doesn't recognize what argument I was making or the arguments that were being made. I was pointing to the very first scholars or figures or individuals, if you will, that made these particular kinds of arguments. And Gavin then saying that, well, I didn't get it from this person. William is wrong. I'm not wrong. Even if you got it from somebody else that essentially took it from that other person, that was the whole point, that the argument originates from this particular scholar or that particular book. I was not wrong in pointing that out. And by the way, where Gavin gets his material from, we're going to examine that in just a moment.
So I've got lots of other things I kind of had written down here to maybe go into. I'm just not even going to. I don't want to pile on, and I really want the overall focus of my channel to be positive, to be about meeting needs for viewers, not just defending myself. But so my comments here.
Now let me make a comment for you, and let me give you some advice, Gavin. It will be some very heartfelt advice. I'm going to tell you that when you tell apostolic Christians that their honor that they give to Holy Mary is in essence idolatry, that when you tell apostolic Christians that the bodily assumption of Saint Mary originates from heretical teachings, that is an insult. It is insulting. It is incredibly and deeply insulting because of the honor and veneration we give to our Holy Mother Mary. If you want the tone of your channel to be a peaceful, ironic kind of tone, a nice kind of tone, you don't make these kinds of accusations without any information to back them up. This is insulting. Now, would I expect any of my followers in my channel to go to your channel and bombard you and make all these sorts of claims? I would not. In fact, I have said it over and over. Do not bombard Gavin's channel. Do not leave comments the way some of his followers come to mine and leave comments. By the way, I get such a chuckle at them. I sometimes wonder, do these people think that I'm thin-skinned? I've been debating for 2 decades now. I've been debating for a very long time. I've gone and debated in person, in public, in very hostile environments. Do you think a Combox comment, you're going to leave me insulting me and saying that that I stink and I suck is going to really hurt my feelings? Pile it on. I love it. I love it. I love it. Pile it on, because here in the world, in the realm of apologetics, if you are not thick-skinned, you don't belong doing apologetics. And I welcome every kind of criticism, because criticism will make you better at what you do, and it shouldn't hurt your feelings. And no, I don't come out and say, well, goodness, this guy insulted me. Man, oh man, oh man. I have told Gavin over and over, I will debate him. Gavin, I've even told Gavin I will appear in his show and dialogue with him on Mariology. His show, he can control it. He can mute me. He can kick me. He can do whatever he wants. I will appear in his show. Look, let's make it even more interesting. Pick one of those guys that have come and commented on my channel and said that I am a meanie. One of those guys can be the moderator. Let's get a debate done. They can moderate a debate between myself and Gavin Ortlund. Gavin Ortlund, I've put the offer out there multiple times, Gavin. You can see debates I've done, and I've debated the same opponents over and over and over. I've debated some of the top scholars in the world multiple times, and they never make the claim that, well, William is too mean. We're never going to debate him again. I invite Gavin to consider debating me on the issue of Mariology.
Or not just to attack someone, but it's because people are watching along and following this discussion. And a lot of people I know are really questioning about this issue, and they're not sure.
I agree with you. I have, thanks be to God, I have gotten so many emails. Thanks be to God, from people that have told me the very fact that Gavin began dealing with the assumption of Mary, and the fact that you began rebutting it and really showing how skewed the information was, has convinced me that Protestantism is false. People have told me they have left Protestantism. You can go look at the comments on my channel. These are real people that are making comments, leaving comments, even people that have launched websites. These are real people that have left Protestantism. And we have to applaud Gavin for doing these videos, because a lot of the people that follow Gavin's material, he's got a great audience. You guys are great people. Even if you don't like him, even if you come to my channel to insult me, Gavin's got a great audience. A lot of really intelligent people. So they're going to follow Gavin's material because Gavin's a nice guy. They think he's a nice guy. They're going to follow his material. And the more and more he does videos, the more and more, well, particularly in Catholicism, the more and more we are going to reply to them. And people are going to come, they're going to look at the videos and they're going to say, well, goodness, there really isn't a good defense for Protestantism. And they're going to realize that Protestantism really is a massively sinking ship, and they better get off the boat, because guess what? One boat is going to sink, one ship is going to sink, and people are going to hop onto another one with another pastor that really has their own personal interpretation. Their interpretation is going to rival another one's, and on and on and on. They are their own arbiters of truth. In essence, they don't have the early church fathers backing them up, and they don't have scholarship backing them up either.
What is the truth about this? And so I offer my comments here out of sincere concern for the truth and for the people who are seeking the truth, who are following this discussion. Because to sum it all up, I would say that at the end of the day, I am sincerely persuaded, deeply, confidently persuaded, that the historical evidence is overwhelmingly against the bodily assumption of Mary being either an apostolic teaching or an actual first century event. Is it from Gnosticism? Well, it's hard to say that with certainty. It's hard to nail down exactly.
Well, I'm glad that towards the end, Gavin really finally gets to the point where he says, you know, it could be, or maybe it's not. The fact of the matter is, Gavin, as we've pointed out, the earliest Greek extant commentary on St. John's Apocalypse very clearly teaches that Mary is a woman of Revelation 12, and teaches that Mary is bodily assumed into heaven in Revelation 12. There's a lot of evidence for the bodily assumption of Mary being biblical and being early traditional in the church. This was taught by multiple early church fathers. So yes, Gavin, it is apostolic. The evidence has been presented to you multiple times, and there has been nothing on your side, no refutation of the earliest. We mentioned the earliest Greek extant commentary on St. John's Apocalypse, and I just mentioned the earliest Greek Dormition commentary as well. The earliest Greek Dormition text as well is not heterodox, very clearly shows a belief in the bodily assumption of St. Mary. So the evidence really is squarely against Protestantism here.
Exactly, the trajectory of influence and causation and what influenced what. But we can certainly say this much: the earliest written attestation we have for the Assumption of Mary comes in a Gnostic text. And Marian devotion also first appears in what, to use Shoemaker's term, a markedly heterodox theological milieu.
Which, again, is just absolutely incorrect. So, number one, Marian devotion. If we're going to talk about Marian devotion that has become widespread outside of the biblical era, we can clearly show that the proto-evangelium of James, or as scholars say, the proto of James, very clearly shows that Marian devotion was very strong already as early as the 100s. But we believe it to be biblical. If St. Mary is presented as a new ark of the new covenant, which she is presented as in Scripture, then of course devotion to Mary is a biblical concept, a very biblical one. And we've done multiple videos on that one. And I even invite Gavin to debate that topic if you would like to. I would love to debate whether or not Holy Mary is a new ark of the new covenant. That would be an incredibly fun debate, and I'd love to have it. Let's get it done. But Marian devotion is biblical. Mary is very clearly the one that is full of grace, and she is the one that complete enmity with the serpent, and she is the one very clearly portrayed as the new ark of the new covenant. But if we want to talk about information outside of the biblical text, we can clearly point to the proto-evangelium of James. Because again, Gavin Ortlund is out of touch with what Dr. Shoemaker has said, because indeed Dr. Shoemaker says something different from his book later on in a different work of his, and very clearly this says, and let's read it, "Yet it seems unmistakably clear that Marian piety antedates the Nestorian controversy, and previous studies have identified important glimmers of devotion to the Virgin from the 4th century in the writings of the Cappadocians. For instance, the famous Subtum Presidium papyrus. But these traces of Marian cult seem insufficient to explain the tidal wave that was to follow. The proto-evangelium of James alerts us to a very early theological interest in the Virgin. And while affording no evidence of cult, but notice what he says, no evidence of cult, this apocryphon appears to reflect the rising doctrinal significance of Mary and perhaps even devotion already in the 2nd century. Devotion in the 2nd century. This is something incredible, and in this information we continue seeing misinformation, misrepresentations being presented by Gavin Ortlund, and we can only just shake our head and just facepalm. Oh goodness, another piece of evidence, another piece of information that Gavin shared that just really just boggled my mind and blew me away. Well, let's check it out. In the very first video that Dr. Ortlund did on the bodily assumption of St. Mary, he quotes a number of individuals that are not actual scholars on the bodily assumption of Mary and the Dormition of Holy Mary. One of them in particular is Eamon Duffy. And I was very perplexed at why and how Gavin would even get it in his mind to quote Duffy, who was not a Dormition or Assumption scholar. I let it pass because I knew what very likely was the case, that Gavin, very likely why he had quoted him. Let's check it out again, though.
going to start getting dogmas that start to extend further and further out from what is clearly attested in Scripture or the early church.
So notice how he says this is a summary of scholarship here.
And there were Catholics who had that concern. Here's how Eamon Duffy, who's a Catholic historian, puts it in his book on the history of the popes. He says, the definition, that's of the bodily assumption, embarrassed many Catholic theologians since it was unsupported in Scripture and unknown in the early church.
Let's really take a screen cap of that in our mind, okay? Check that out. Look at that portion of text that Gavin is quoting from.
And this is what many Catholic scholars will admit, that there's just no evidence for it whatsoever. In his book on Mary, Duffy puts it pretty much like that. He says, quote, there is clearly no historical evidence whatever for it, unless one counts the negative evidence of the lack of post-mortem relics of the Virgin. Now, a lot of...
Now, I wonder if Gavin's read either of those works. Very doubtful he has, because the second one is not a book on Mary. It is not a book. It's a tiny little tract, or a little booklet, if you will, out of print. It's been out of print for quite some time now. So where would Gavin even get the idea of even sharing this information? Where did Gavin get it from in your mind? In fact, let's do this so we can check it out better. Now that you've got a mental picture of this, of what Gavin quotes in his video, check out that quote snippet, and then this quote snippet as well. The mistaking this for actually being a book. You got to wonder, well, Gavin, has he read this stuff? Why would he think this is a book? Has he even read it? Where does he get it? Notice his quotes right here. The little snippet here. Notice his quotes. And you find the exact quotes from an anti-Catholic, anti-Trinitarian, anti-Christian website. Eamon Duffy on the bodily assumption of Mary. Notice the exact quote utilized here. The exact quote. The exact one. And Duffy and the author of this anti-Trinitarian website doesn't note that this is not a book. So it's very clear as to why Gavin didn't know that this here was not a book. Very clear as to why he didn't know it wasn't a book, because he very clearly likely got it from this anti-Christian, anti-Trinitarian, anti-Mariology website from this gentleman who does not like Holy Mary, utilizes a distortion of Holy Mary that is taught within Mormonism, denies the Trinity, blasphemes against our triune God, blasphemes against the deity of Christ, and of course, utilize this information from someone who is not a scholar. Hats off to the anti-Trinitarian, though. He notes that Duffy's a historian. He's not a scholar in the bodily assumption of Mary. So perhaps somebody pointed Gavin to this mistaken information, and he literally utilized the very same. By the way, I know that there's another website that uses one of these quotes now, but there's no other website that uses these two quotes and these two snippets the way Boylan does, the way this anti-Trinitarian does. Notice the quote here. Now, people may say, well, you know what, William, if it's true, fair game to him. The problem is it isn't true. Number one, Duffy is not a scholar on the bodily assumption of Mary. And in his video, he says a summary of the scholarship. Number one, Duffy is not a scholar in the Dormition of Holy Mary. And number two, are you actually doing the research and reading the material if the exact quotes and snippets are being taken from an anti-Trinitarian website? Are you actually doing the homework? Now, this website, this article is from 2018. There's nobody that placed these two quotes side by side before this anti-Trinitarian website did. So I have to ask and wonder, what is the point of utilizing this? And is Gavin actually reading the material, or is he quote mining? This is the one thing that I've got to wonder. Is he reading the material, or is he quote mining? That is a major difference. whether one is actually reading the material or whether they are just taking quotes and snippets without realizing, number one, Duffy's not a scholar in the Assumption. Number two, this is not a book. Not a book. Nobody's going to be reading these two sources for information, the bodily Assumption of Mary. And number three, it is taken from an anti-Trinitarian website where a lot of misinformation is presented. A lot of misinformation is presented. We recommend reading first-hand source material and actual scholarly material, not stuff taken from an anti-Trinitarian website, which maybe Gavin was not aware of it. Maybe somebody else passed it on to him and he did not personally get it from here. Maybe that is the scenario. All we have to do is point out that this is very, very suspect and it's very disappointing to us. Now, if you have gotten through the video thus far, I'm going to have to applaud you. About 2 hours. In the beginning, I thought I was probably going to do half an hour, maybe an hour at the most. We ended up going almost 2 full hours, and I think that we had to really do that in order to really, truly, fully refute pretty much everything being put out there, but to really deal with the information, even though we've dealt with it before. Again, I conclude in inviting the audience to head over to Pints of Aquinas, where I've debated the bodily Assumption of Mary. Check that out. Check out primary source material. Read what the early church fathers have to say. I've done a number of videos where I quote them. I've done a number of shows. Just go to my channel, look up bodily Assumption. You're going to find a ton of them. And I'm going to put a plug in, of course, for my Patreon. On my Patreon there, you will find probably 40 hours or more of Mariology that is not available on my YouTube, where I give private courses to closed groups. And I just got done with a mega session on the Assumption of Mary, where there are tons of quotes there. If you are able, definitely consider supporting us in Patreon. If you're not able to, as I've said before, the greatest kind of support anyone can get is the support of prayer. Pray for me. Hit like, share, subscribe to the material that you have here. I hope you've been edified. And I want to emphasize again the incredible information we have in the bodily Assumption of Holy Mary. And I'm going to conclude it again with going over the magnificent information that we have in St. John's Apocalypse. Done it before, and I never get tired of it. How could I ever tire of Holy Writ? How could I ever tire of sacred scripture? I never will. And I'm thrilled that you were able to really sit through this whole thing. I hope you were edified. And for people that are wondering, William, are you going to debate Mariology again? I hope that I will. Right now, we're trying to set a date for a Sola Fide debate. Then after that, I'm debating Purgatory 3 times this year. And then I'll be debating Mariology, probably in winter, an incredible in-person debate against a top Islamic scholar. Then another debate on the Suffering Servant against Dr. Shabir Ali. Really looking forward to all of that. Keep in touch, really hit subscribe, put the notification bell. If you have not done that yet, thank you very much for tuning in. Let us close out this show by examining the bodily Assumption of Holy Mary, very clearly alluded to in the book of St. John's Apocalypse, and a patristic commentary on that as well. Thank you for tuning in. God bless you. Then the temple of God was opened in heaven, and the ark of his covenant was seen in his temple. And there were lightnings, noises, thunderings, an earthquake, and great hail. Now, we've done a number of videos already showing you that Holy Mary, Saint Mary, is indeed the new ark of the new covenant. Again, we emphasize, if you have not gotten our book yet on Mary, check the link down below. Get a hold of that book. We hope you get it. We break down the biblical case from the biblical Greek and from the patristics that clearly Holy Mary is the new ark of the new covenant. She is the new ark. She is the all-holy ark of the Lord. Look at Revelation 11, directly connected by Greek grammar and clearly recognized by the church fathers as well. with Revelation 12. Now a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. Yes, this Greek word for crown is utilized elsewhere as well. It is a crown, indicative of royalty. Then, being with child, she cried out in labor and in pain to give birth. And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great fiery red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 diadems on his head. His tail drew a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth, and the dragon stood before the woman who was ready to give birth, to devour her child as soon as it was born. She bore a male child. Historically, primarily, Revelation 12 is Mariological. Only the historical figure of Holy Mary gave birth to the male child that will rule the nations with a rod of iron. Her child was caught up to God and his throne. Then the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God. They should feed her there 1,260 days. This is Holy Mary. War broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought with the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought, but they did not prevail. Nor was a place for them in heaven any longer found. So the great dragon was cast out. How do we know this is a dragon prophesied of in Genesis 3, where that woman who was clearly Holy Mary is prophesied that would be at complete enmity with the devil? Well, we're told that serpent of old, called the dragon and Satan, who deceives the whole world, he was cast to the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. Then I heard a loud voice saying in heaven, now salvation and strength and the kingdom of our God and the power of his Christ have come. For the accuser of our brethren who accused them before our God day and night has been cast down. And they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, and they did not love their lives to the death. Therefore rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. Woe to the inhabitants of the earth and the sea, for the devil has come down to you, having great wrath, because he knows that he has a short time. There's more. Now, when the dragon had been cast down to the earth, he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child. But the woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness to her place, where she is nourished for a time and times and a half time from the presence of the serpent. The serpent spewed out water out of its mouth like a flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away by the flood. But the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed up the flood which the dragon had spewed out of his mouth. And the dragon was enraged with the woman, and he went to make war with the rest of her offspring. Look at that. The woman is presented as the mother of the church. This is not literal children, because we know that, because we're told who are the children of the woman, who was clearly Holy Mary. They're the ones who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. They have the testimony of Jesus Christ. When we look at the earliest extant Greek commentary on St. John's Apocalypse, indeed, we run into the magnificent theology and the words of Oikoumenios. Oikoumenios in the 500s tells us, when he quotes St. John's Apocalypse, since again the Lord's physical conception and birth marked the beginning of his incarnation, the vision has brought into some order and sequence the events which it is going to explain. By starting its explanation from the physical conception of Christ and by depicting for us the mother of God. For why does he say, and a sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet? He is speaking of the mother of our Savior. As I have said, naturally the vision describes her as being in heaven and not on the earth, as pure in soul and body, as equal to an angel, as a citizen of heaven, as one who came to effect the incarnation of God, who dwells in heaven, pure in soul and body. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and the Holy Spirit. God bless you.